Did you think childhood was always part of human life? That every society understood children as something fragile, something to protect, something to educate? For most of human history, this idea did not exist. There was no concept of childhood as a protected stage of life, no special years reserved for learning, rest, or development. A child was simply a smaller adult, an incomplete worker, a future laborer. In agricultural societies, children worked as soon as they were physically able, carrying water, watching animals, harvesting crops. This was not seen as cruelty, it was seen as necessity. In pre-industrial families, survival depended on collective labor. Every person had to contribute. Every mouth had to justify itself. A child who did not work was considered a burden. There were no laws protecting children, no minimum working age, no limits on working hours. In medieval Europe, children were often sent away from home by the age of 5 or 6, apprenticed to craftsmen, placed in households of strangers. Apprenticeship was not education in the modern sense, it was controlled labor under authority. Physical punishment was normal. Hunger was common. Illness was expected. Children were disciplined like adults, punished like adults, forgotten like adults. High child mortality shaped how society viewed children. In many regions, up to half of all children died before the age of 10. When death is common, emotional attachment becomes dangerous. Parents loved their children, but love was restrained. Loss was expected. Food was not planned for growth, it was planned for survival. Children ate what adults ate, when food existed. There were no children's portions, no nutritional planning. Malnutrition was widespread. Stunted growth was normal. Shoes were rare. Clothing was reused endlessly. A child often owned one outfit, sometimes none. There were no stores for children, no toys designed for development. Toys, when they existed, were handmade, simple, occasional. Most children owned no personal objects. Privacy did not exist. Comfort did not exist. Beds were shared. Rooms were shared. In cities, entire families slept in a single space. Disease spread easily. Children were not prioritized for treatment. Medicine was limited. Doctors were rare. Hospitals were often places to die. Education, as we understand it today, was almost non-existent. Schooling was reserved for clergy, nobility, or future administrators. The majority of children never learned to read. Illiteracy was normal. Ignorance was normal. There was no understanding of child development, no psychology, no protection. Children were expected to adapt. Society was not expected to change. This was the world for thousands of years. And then, industry arrived, and childhood became even shorter. Industrialization did not create child labor, but it transformed it. Before factories, children worked within households and small communities. With industrialization, labor became centralized, intensified, and relentless. Factories required a workforce that was cheap, obedient, and replaceable. Children met all three conditions. In early 19th century Britain, an estimated 30 to 40% of industrial workers were children. In textile mills, the percentage often exceeded 50%. Children began working as young as 4 to 6 years old, not as exceptions, as standard practice. A typical factory workday lasted 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Work began before sunrise and ended after dark. Children were allowed only brief pauses, often just enough time to eat, if food was provided. Factory environments were extremely dangerous. There were no safety standards, no protective guards on machines. Belts, gears, and rotating shafts were fully exposed. Children were frequently assigned to clean machines while they were running, because adults were too large and children were cheaper. Accidents were constant: crushed fingers, severed limbs, scalp injuries. Contemporary factory reports describe children being pulled entirely into machines. Production rarely stopped. The child was removed, the machine continued. Coal mines were even more severe. Children worked underground in Britain, Belgium, France, and Germany. Many began before the age of 8, some as young as 4. Children performed specific roles. Trappers sat alone in total darkness for hours, opening and closing ventilation doors. Some saw no daylight for days. Haulers dragged coal carts through narrow tunnels, often using chains attached to their bodies. Their spines bent permanently. Their growth was deformed. Air quality was lethal. Coal dust caused chronic lung disease. Many children developed respiratory failure before adolescence. Explosions and collapses were common. Entire groups of children died in a single incident. There were no compensation systems, no official records, no public mourning. Urban agriculture also relied heavily on child labor. Children worked in city farms, slaughterhouses, docks, and markets. They carried heavy loads, handled animals, worked with knives and tools. In all these environments, injury was normal. Pain was expected. Medical treatment was rare. An injured child was often sent back to work the same day. At night, there was no recovery. Children slept on floors, in overcrowded rooms, in thin clothing. During winter, many froze. These conditions were documented, not hidden. Governments knew, factory owners knew, society accepted it, because children were not yet seen as something to protect. They were seen as economic units. This system persisted well into the late 19th century, and in many parts of the world even longer. For most of human history, food was the central problem of childhood. Not education, not comfort, not safety. Food. Children did not eat to grow, they ate to survive. In pre-industrial societies, diets were monotonous and limited. Bread, porridge, roots, occasionally vegetables. Meat was rare, milk was unreliable, fruit was seasonal. Children ate what adults ate when food was available. There was no concept of child nutrition, no understanding of vitamins, no knowledge of calories or protein requirements. As a result, chronic malnutrition was widespread. Children were shorter, weaker, more vulnerable to disease. Stunted growth was not considered abnormal. It was expected. In many regions of Europe during the Middle Ages, childhood famine was a recurring event. Crop failures, harsh winters, wars. When food ran short, children were the first to suffer. Adults were prioritized. Workers were prioritized. Children were expendable. In cities, the situation was often worse. Urban families depended entirely on markets. When prices rose, food disappeared. Children survived on diluted soup, moldy bread, occasionally nothing. Starvation rarely looked dramatic. It was slow. Weight loss, weakness, infections. Many children died quietly, at home, without records. Disease thrived in these conditions. Clean water was rare. Rivers served as sewers. Wells were contaminated. Children drank polluted water daily. This led to frequent outbreaks of infectious disease: cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery. Respiratory illnesses were constant: tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis. Crowded living conditions accelerated transmission. Entire families slept in one room, often in one bed. In working-class neighborhoods, ventilation was poor, light was limited, air quality was toxic. Children's immune systems were weak due to malnutrition. Minor infections became fatal. Medical care was extremely limited. Doctors were expensive. Hospitals were few. Hospitals were not places of healing. They were places of isolation, often places of death. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no effective treatments for most diseases. Bloodletting was common. Herbal remedies were inconsistent. Prayer was often the primary response. Infant mortality rates were extremely high. In many European cities in the 18th and early 19th centuries, 30 to 50% of children died before the age of 5. In some industrial cities, the rate was even higher. Child death was so common that it shaped family behavior. Parents often delayed emotional attachment, not because they did not care, but because loss was expected. Children were named late, baptized quickly. Some families avoided naming a child until survival seemed likely. This distance was a form of psychological protection. Nutrition during illness was poor. Sick children were often denied food, based on the belief that digestion weakened the body. Many died of dehydration. Public sanitation was minimal. Garbage accumulated in streets. Animals lived alongside humans. Children played in contaminated environments. They worked in them. They slept in them. Epidemics swept through cities regularly. When outbreaks occurred, children died in large numbers. Schools, when they existed, closed. Factories rarely did. Orphanhood was widespread. Many children lost one or both parents before adolescence. Orphans were absorbed into labor systems, workhouses, apprenticeships, institutions. These institutions prioritized productivity, not health. Food in workhouses was deliberately minimal, designed to discourage dependence. Children were kept alive, barely. Despite this, societies largely accepted child mortality. It was seen as unavoidable, as natural, as part of life. There was little public outrage, little political pressure. Children were not yet considered a protected population. This perspective would only begin to change in the late 19th century, when statistics became visible, when science advanced, when death could be measured. Only then did societies begin to ask a new question: not how many children survive, but why so many die. For most of human history, children did not have possessions, not in the modern sense. Clothing was not an expression of identity, it was a basic necessity, and often it was insufficient. Most children owned one set of clothes, sometimes two, often none that were exclusively theirs. Children wore hand-me-downs from older siblings, from relatives, from deceased children. Clothing circulated within families and communities until it physically disintegrated. Fabric was valuable. Nothing was discarded easily. Children's clothes were not designed for comfort. They were simplified versions of adult garments, restrictive, heavy, poorly fitted. In many periods, children wore adult-style clothing from early childhood. There was no separate concept of children's fashion. Loose garments were uncommon. Movement was restricted. This made work more difficult, but that was not considered a problem. Laundry was infrequent. Soap was expensive. Clean clothes were rare. As a result, skin infections were common. Parasites were common. Lice were widespread. Shoes were even rarer than clothing. In rural areas, most children went barefoot year-round, including winter. In cities, shoes were often shared. One pair per family, used only when absolutely necessary. Children developed thick calluses, cracked skin, open wounds. Foot infections were frequent. They often went untreated. Ill-fitting shoes caused permanent deformities, but this was not recognized as a medical issue. Shoes were expensive. They required skilled labor. Leather was costly. As a result, footwear was considered a luxury, not a necessity. There were no shoe sizes for children, no ergonomic design, no consideration for growth. In many industrial cities, children worked barefoot in factories and mines, on stone floors, among sharp debris. Stores, as we understand them today, did not exist for children. Markets existed, but they sold essentials: food, tools, raw materials. There were no children's sections, no toys aisles, no clothing racks designed for age groups. Children did not browse, they did not choose. Purchasing decisions were made exclusively by adults, based on survival needs. Most children never entered a store alone. Personal belongings were minimal. A child might own a spoon, a cup, sometimes a blanket. Toys were rare. When toys existed, they were handmade: wooden objects, cloth dolls, simple tools repurposed for play. Play was not structured. It happened in brief moments, between tasks. There was no concept of toys as tools for development, no understanding of cognitive stimulation. Books were almost non-existent for children. Books were expensive. Printing was costly. Literacy was rare. If a child encountered a book, it was usually religious or instructional. Illustrated children's books did not exist. Furniture was shared. Children rarely had their own beds or their own space. Entire families slept together, sometimes multiple families in one room. Privacy did not exist. Personal space did not exist. Comfort was not a design goal. It was an afterthought. Heating was limited. Firewood was expensive. Coal polluted the air. Children slept in cold conditions, even indoors. In contrast, by 2026, material conditions for children are fundamentally different. Children have clothing designed specifically for their bodies, for movement, for comfort. Shoes are designed by size, by age, by activity. Children own personal belongings: toys, books, electronic devices. Stores are designed around children. Entire industries exist to serve them. Children choose, they browse, they express preferences. Personal space is normalized: bedrooms, beds, desks. Comfort is expected. Cleanliness is standard. This transformation did not occur suddenly. It required industrial productivity, lower material scarcity, higher wages. Only when societies could produce abundance did children begin to receive more than the minimum. Material comfort was one of the first visible signs that childhood was changing, not because society became kinder, but because scarcity decreased. This shift laid the foundation for the next transformation: the changing role of parents, the changing structure of the family. For most of human history, the family was not a place of comfort. It was a unit of survival. The primary function of the family was economic, producing food, generating labor, ensuring survival. Emotional well-being was secondary, often irrelevant. Parents were not evaluated by how nurturing they were. They were evaluated by whether the family survived. Authority within the family was strict, hierarchical, unquestioned. Fathers held formal power. They controlled labor, resources, decisions. Mothers worked continuously, in the household, in agriculture, in domestic labor for others. Child-rearing was not specialized. There were no parenting guides, no developmental advice. Children were expected to obey, immediately, without explanation. Disobedience was seen as a threat to survival. Physical punishment was widely accepted. Beatings were considered educational, necessary, corrective. Corporal punishment was legal, socially approved, encouraged. In many cultures, children were beaten publicly, at home, in workshops, in schools. Pain was a teaching tool. Fear was a management tool. There was no concept of psychological harm. Emotional trauma was not recognized. Children were not considered emotionally vulnerable. They were considered resilient by necessity. Large families were common, not by choice, but because infant mortality was high. Parents expected to lose children. This shaped attachment. Emotional distance was common, not because parents did not care, but because constant grief was unsustainable. Many parents avoided excessive affection as a form of self-protection. Children were often raised collectively, by extended family, by older siblings, by communities. Individual attention was rare. In urban working-class families, supervision was minimal. Parents worked long hours. Children were left alone or sent to work. Neglect was structural, not intentional. Alcohol abuse was widespread, especially among men in industrial cities. Domestic violence was common and largely tolerated. Legal systems rarely intervened in family matters. The household was considered private. Children had no legal standing, no independent rights. A child belonged to the father, legally, economically, socially. In many societies, children could be legally beaten, sold, or abandoned. Orphan children were absorbed into institutions, workhouses, charitable homes, religious institutions. These institutions emphasized discipline, obedience, productivity. Affection was discouraged. Emotional bonds were seen as distractions. Daily life was regulated by punishment and routine. Silence was valued. Compliance was rewarded. Family life was not centered around children. Children were centered around family needs. This began to change slowly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Several factors contributed: declining child mortality, rising wages, shorter working hours, and the emergence of psychology and pediatrics. Children began to be seen as developing individuals, not just labor units. Parenthood began to shift from authority to responsibility. Physical punishment started to be questioned, not eliminated, but challenged. By 2026, the structure of the family has fundamentally changed. Children are legally protected within families. Physical abuse is criminalized. Neglect is monitored. Parents are expected to nurture, to educate, to protect. Emotional development is recognized as essential. The family is no longer only an economic unit. It is an emotional one. This shift is historically recent and culturally specific. It required law, science, social change, and it remains incomplete. In many parts of the world, older models persist. The transformation of the family was a critical step, but it was not the final one. The next major shift would occur in education. For most of human history, children had no rights, not in law, not in society, not in the family. A child was property of the father, of the household, of the employer. There was no legal distinction between discipline and abuse, no legal protection against exploitation. This began to change slowly in the late 19th century. The first child labor laws were not motivated by compassion. They were motivated by economics and public health. Factories realized that injured children were unproductive. Governments realized that an unhealthy population weakened the state. Early laws limited working hours, not to protect childhood, but to preserve future workers. These laws were weak, poorly enforced, often ignored. Over time, reforms expanded. Minimum working ages were introduced. Compulsory education reduced child labor indirectly. The concept of the child began to change. Children were no longer seen only as labor, they were seen as future citizens. In the 20th century, legal protections expanded rapidly. Public health systems developed. Vaccination programs reduced child mortality. Social welfare programs emerged. Food assistance, healthcare access. Child abuse laws were introduced. Neglect became a legal concept. For the first time, the state intervened in the family. This was controversial, but it fundamentally altered childhood. In 1989, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This document defined children as rights-bearing individuals. It established the right to education, the right to health care, the right to protection from exploitation, the right to rest and play. By 2026, most countries have ratified these principles. Child labor is illegal in most of the world. Education is compulsory. Health care for children is prioritized. Nutrition is monitored. Children are vaccinated, regularly examined. The modern child lives in an environment designed for safety. Homes are heated, water is clean, food is regulated. Products for children are tested, regulated, standardized. Parents are legally responsible for care, not just survival. Violence is criminalized. Neglect is monitored. Children now own possessions. They have personal space. They have privacy. Technology is part of daily life. Television, computers, mobile devices. Entertainment is regulated, age-appropriate, designed for development. School is not optional. Work is restricted. Childhood is long, structured, protected. This did not happen naturally. It required law, science, economic growth. It required societies to accept a fundamental change. Children are not resources, they are responsibilities. By historical standards, the world of 2026 is unprecedented. For thousands of years, childhood was short, harsh, and unprotected. Now, for the first time in human history, large populations of children grow up without working, without hunger, without constant risk of death. This does not mean suffering has disappeared, but it is no longer considered normal. This is the defining difference. Modern childhood is not accidental. It is a social construction. Built, it can be weakened or reversed, which makes understanding its history essential. Not to create nostalgia, but to recognize what was changed and why it matters. Because childhood is not natural, it was created, and it must be protected. Education was not considered necessary for children. It was considered optional or dangerous. Knowledge was power, and power was meant to be controlled. In pre-modern societies, education was reserved for elites, clergy, administrators, nobility. The majority of children never attended school. They were expected to work. When schools existed, they were harsh environments, not places of curiosity, not places of safety. Discipline was the central principle. Learning was based on repetition, memorization, obedience. Understanding was secondary. Questioning was discouraged. Physical punishment was a standard educational tool. Beatings were routine, public, normalized. Students were struck for mistakes, for inattention, for speaking. Silence was enforced. Fear maintained order. Teachers were authority figures, not mentors, not caregivers. Children were expected to endure, not to enjoy learning. Schools operated on rigid schedules, long hours, minimal breaks. Hygiene was poor. Overcrowding was common. Disease spread easily in classrooms. Many children attended school only seasonally, during winter, when agricultural work slowed. For working-class children, school was often temporary, interrupted by labor, or ended permanently. Girls were educated less than boys, often not at all. Education for girls focused on obedience, domestic skills, religious instruction. Literacy rates remained low for centuries. In early 19th century Europe, less than half of adults could read. In some regions, far fewer. Compulsory education did not exist. Families decided whether children attended school. Economic necessity almost always won. The introduction of compulsory education was revolutionary and controversial. Governments began mandating school attendance in the late 19th century, often in direct conflict with industrial interests. Factory owners resisted. Families resisted. School meant lost income, lost labor. Early compulsory schools still used harsh discipline. Corporal punishment persisted, but attendance slowly increased. Literacy improved. Education began to reshape childhood. Children spent more time learning, less time working. Schools introduced age-based grouping, curricula, assessment. Child development began to be studied. Psychology emerged. Pedagogy developed. Education shifted from punishment to instruction, slowly, unevenly. By the mid-20th century, schooling became a central feature of childhood. Education was no longer optional, it was expected.
By 2026, education has transformed completely. School is compulsory in most countries. Child labor is restricted or illegal. Corporal punishment in schools is banned in many regions. Teaching focuses on development, critical thinking, creativity. Schools are designed for children, not for control. There are age-appropriate materials, child-centered spaces. Education now includes health, nutrition, emotional development. Technology is integrated, digital tools, online resources. Learning extends beyond classrooms. Education has become a defining element of childhood. But this system is historically recent. It exists because societies chose to invest in children, rather than extract labor from them. This choice reshaped the future. The final transformation would be legal. The recognition of children's rights,